Storytellers don't just talk about the world, they shape it. The stories we share are like soil. They're living, dynamic, and the kinds of stories we choose to tell determines the kind of world that grows around us. All right, I want to talk about a tension that exists in the world of storytelling, and it's the torn between of whether or not you want to make your message bold and blatantly obvious where you can't miss it, or if you want to be a little more subtle and coach from behind and let the audience draw its conclusion on its own. Yeah, this is a common dilemma for many creatives. How obvious is too obvious? How subtle is too subtle? Now, you know you don't want to be too obvious, right? You don't want to come across as preachy or insult the intelligence of someone who might be watching you. But if you're so artsy and subtle and metaphorical about that, you also run the risk of nobody knowing what you're talking about or trying to do here and it just falling flat. Let me walk you through my own journey of how I came to put subtlety on such a pedestal, and then the big pushback I got against that and where I am now, and kind of how I try and see if I'm going too far in either direction. So when you are young and just starting to get into art, be it TV shows or cartoons or kids' books or whatever, you like what you like, and it's that simple. Right? Like, my kids are 0% self-conscious about what their favorite shows are and what that might say about them. It's when you start to get into like middle school and high school, maybe it's earlier than that, but you know, that's when you start to become more self-conscious, where you start to think that your tastes are maybe a reflection of who you are, and you start to be more selective about what likes you're willing to share with the world. For me, in high school, it became really important to like things that I thought had a high artistic value. You know, indie music, obscure foreign films, and some of that stuff did not age as well as I thought it would. But the whole point is I started to make this connection that the more artistic something was, the harder it was to interpret. And so the more cryptic or enigmatic a movie would be, the more I would think, yeah, that's got some artistry to it. Like, you watch some popular movies, which can be okay, but aren't really critically lauded or anything, and the moral of the story is just like right there, and it's so obvious, it's in black and white, you can't miss it. When it's poorly done, it comes across as preachy. But I started to realize a lot of the films I liked weren't so straightforward, and some of the most creative works didn't seem to be making a statement at all. They seemed to be asking a question, and that's so much more open-ended. I'm thinking about those films in the Criterion collection, you know, the ones. They worked with a lot of metaphors. The emotions were complex. The characters, the people were complex. You didn't really know if you were rooting for someone or against them, or if you were supposed to, and it kind of felt like it was up to you to fill it in with your own meaning. It was left open to your interpretation, audience member. And my observation was that, like, this open-endedness correlated with being a highly praised, critically acclaimed work of art. In fact, I can still hear the voices of some friends I knew back in the day from college or high school just critiquing things of being too on the nose or too obvious. Now, of course, this is about the same time where I was highly invested in making my own creative projects, music, videos, whatever. And so I started to ask myself that same question. Am I being too obvious? And then whenever I felt like I was teetering on that edge, I would pull it back. I would scale it and obscure the meaning or the point, hide it in some analogy or metaphor. Now, in some ways, that push was really good for me. It got me in the habit of asking, hey, are there different ways of expressing this idea? And then once I found those, I would then ask which one makes the most sense for the audience I've got in front of me. But of course, that was only positive up to a certain point, because after a while, it actually became something I could hide behind. Like, I can make art that doesn't need to say anything, and I can just hide behind looking smart and being like, well, that's up to you to decide. What do you think it means? I'll never tell. But you know what's ironic? If I zoom out and ask myself, what are my favorite stories? It's the ones that made strong choices. I mean, think of those Pete Docter Pixar movies. You know, they have a strong point of view. They make clear choices. But there's no denying the creative ingenuity that goes into something like Inside Out or Soul. Ambiguity, subtlety does not make great art by default. And at the same time, having a clear point to make does not make something bad art. It just means there's different risks involved. There are examples of great stories being told all over the spectrum, from the enigmatic to the plain. All that to say, there's room for a wide variety of approaches, and this is true even when it comes to creative change making. So art that accompanies political or social movements tends to be not so subtle, you know? I think some of the strongest examples of this might be like propaganda art, where it has the message for you just in big, bold block letters, or those after-school specials, where it's just like the sitcom character gets into some trouble, all so that you get the point. Don't do drugs, kids. And then you have stories that are told to raise awareness around a certain issue. And you know, Blood Diamond, I think, is not in the same category as an after-school special, but there's a degree of hand-holding to that sort of genre. At the same time, though, you have a lot of, like, let's say hip-hop songs that are very frequently misunderstood. An artist might be describing the violence that surrounded them as they grew up, and it's very easy to mistake critiquing or calling things the way they are as condoning it. Well, if you're at the helm of a creative project and your ultimate goal is to get a point across or to challenge a way of thinking, you got to think through, at what point is it so subtle that people don't get what I'm trying to say, and at what point is it so preachy that people are turned off? Let me tell you the things you want to consider. Number one, what are the conventions around the thing you're making? Let's say you're making a video for nonprofits to pick up more child sponsorships. Like, you probably want to make that call to action unambiguous, right? There are other gateways in there to channel some of your creative energy, but you don't want people to miss the point, which is that they should go sponsor one of those kids. But then other times, maybe you just want to challenge conventional thinking around stereotypes or around common assumptions people make. I think that's where you get a lot more opportunity to be open-ended. A great example of this that I've recently seen was They Clone Tyrone, which takes a lot of tropes from the blaxploitation genre and takes a bunch of black stereotypes and flips it on its head to, make a statement about how those stereotypes are leveraged. The medium of what you're using to make will also have an effect. The medium you're using will also have an effect on what your audience's expectations and tolerance is for ambiguity. You know, a genre like musical theater is meant to be larger than life. It's meant to be something that can reach from a stage all the way into the back row. Meanwhile, something like visual art that people are viewing close up tends to have a lot more room for open-endedness. But I think the most important thing is, where is your audience at? Different audiences will have different levels of tolerance for ambiguity around communication. You know, you ever watch like a Korean drama or a movie from the Philippines or a Latin American country and think, wow, they really turn up the drama to 10 here. And it's not just culture that's going to determine where your audience is. You can think of where they'll be physically. How are they going to be consuming what you're creating? Will it be at a computer, on their phone, in a theater? All those things will have an impact on how heavy subtlety can land or not. Typically, if you're making something for a group or a crowd, you're going to want to make it less cryptic because you want to speak to a set of shared values or beliefs, you know? Think of the types of songs they play to pump people up at stadiums. Those don't have mixed messages. And then, of course, think about your goal. What are you trying to do? Are you trying to get people to vote? Are you trying to get people to donate? Or are you just trying to get people to reconsider an assumption they had? When I think of the latter, of someone who uses ambiguity in art to challenge ideas and assumptions, I think Jordan Peele is a great example. It's very easy to misinterpret his movies, but if you start going down the rabbit hole of discussions on what do these themes mean in some of his films, there's some very meaty discussion to be had. Finally, it's good to be aware of your own personal tendencies just so you can keep them in check. I've been doing some improv classes lately, and so that's where this idea comes from. You know, I had a teacher who pointed out to me, like, hey, don't be afraid to make your choices on stage extremely obvious. In improv, this is a benefit to your audience, and it's also a benefit to your scene partners. They won't mistake what you're trying to do. And so now, when I perform, I just go out with the mentality that, hey, I am a literal cartoon character for now. You know, I can feel complex emotions or whatever, but just, like, exaggerate it, blow it up. That's an appropriate space. So, creative change makers, if you're struggling with this, just think. What are the conventions and expectations around what you're making? Where's your audience at? What is your own goal with this particular piece? And what is your own tendency? Thanks, and as always, I'll see you on the next Creative Changemaker.